It is July 16th, 1945, and the desert of Alamogordo, New Mexico, is about to stop being ordinary. In the pre-dawn darkness, 100 scientists and soldiers crouch behind earthworks and welders' goggles, some 20 kilometers from a spindly steel tower. Rain has been falling for hours, and tempers among the men huddled in the control bunker are as frayed as the weather. Somewhere above them, clipped to the top of that tower, sits a device the size of a beach ball, wrapped in cables and wired with detonators like something built by a jeweler with a grudge. At 5.29 and 45 seconds in the morning, a switch is thrown. For a fraction of a second, nothing happens. Then the desert turns to daylight brighter than the sun itself, a column of fire and dust rises faster than the eye can follow it, and a shockwave rolls across the basin, rattling windows in towns the observers had never heard of, more than 160 kilometers away. Robert Oppenheimer, watching from the bunker, would later recall a line from the Bhagavad Gita. Kenneth Bainbridge, the physicist who ran the test, put it more plainly, turning to Oppenheimer and telling him that now they were all sons of bitches. Neither man was exaggerating. In that moment, in that patch of scrubland the Spanish had once called Jornada del Muerto, the journey of the dead man, humanity had built something it could never entirely put down again. This is the story of how that happened. Not merely the story of a bomb, though the bomb is at its center, but the story of an almost unimaginable industrial and intellectual mobilization, one that pulled together refugees fleeing fascism, farm boys from Tennessee, British scientists smuggled across the Atlantic, and some of the finest minds of the 20th century, all racing against a clock nobody could see and an enemy they were not certain was even in the same race. It cost more than $2 billion, a staggering sum for the 1940s, employed over 130,000 people at its peak, and remained so secret that the Vice President of the United States did not know it existed until the man he was replacing died in office. Understanding why it happened, and how ordinary people built something so extraordinary in such a short space of time, tells us something essential about the century we still live in the shadow of. Consider, for a moment, the strangeness of what those 130,000 workers actually experienced. Most of them, the welders and machinists and secretaries who filled the vast plants of Tennessee and Washington state, had no idea what they were building. They knew only that they were assembling something for the war effort, something so secret that speaking about their work outside the factory gates, even to a spouse, could result in arrest. Entire towns sprang from nothing in a matter of months, populated by tens of thousands of people who had been told almost nothing about their purpose, living behind fences patrolled by armed guards in a country that was, officially, not building anything of the kind at all. It is this combination of towering scientific ambition on one hand and vast, compartmentalized secrecy on the other that makes the Manhattan Project such a singular episode in the history of the 20th century. To understand why the Manhattan Project had to happen, you have to go back to a letter and to a fear. In August 1939, with Europe sliding towards war, the physicist Leo Szilard drafted a letter for Albert Einstein's signature, warning President Franklin Roosevelt that recent work on uranium fission raised the possibility of extremely powerful bombs. The fear driving Szilard was not abstract. German scientists had been the ones to discover nuclear fission in the first place, in Berlin in December 1938, when Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann split a uranium atom and Lise Meitner, exiled in Sweden, worked out what it meant. Germany had access to some of the best physicists in the world, a captured uranium mine in Czechoslovakia, and, crucially, a substantial head start in theoretical understanding. For men like Szilard, Enrico Fermi, and Eugene Wigner, many of them Jewish refugees who had fled Hitler's Europe with a personal understanding of what a Nazi victory would mean, the possibility that Germany might build an atomic weapon first was not paranoia. It was the single most rational fear a physicist could hold in 1939. The scientific problem itself was staggering in scale. Uranium exists in nature mostly as an isotope called U-238, which does not sustain the kind of chain reaction needed for a weapon. The fissile isotope, U-235, makes up less than 1% of natural uranium, and separating the two, given that they are chemically identical and differ in mass by barely more than 1%, was a problem that had defeated conventional chemistry entirely. Nobody in 1940 knew for certain how much of the rare isotope would even be needed to sustain an explosive chain reaction, whether it was kilograms or tons, and nobody had built industrial machinery capable of separating isotopes at any meaningful scale. There was a second, entirely separate possible path as well, through a newly identified element called plutonium, which did not occur in nature in usable quantities and would have to be manufactured, atom by atom, inside a nuclear reactor nobody had yet built. Early British estimates, produced by a group of scientists working largely in isolation and later known as the Maud Committee, suggested a bomb might be built with somewhere in the region of 10 kilograms of separated U-235, a figure that shocked American scientists into taking the whole project seriously. Even so, building the industrial infrastructure to isolate that material, or to manufacture plutonium instead, meant solving chemistry, physics, engineering, and metallurgy problems that had never been attempted, on a timescale measured in months rather than the years or decades such research would ordinarily take, all while keeping the entire effort hidden from an enemy intelligence service and, almost as importantly, from an Allies intelligence service in Moscow. It is difficult to overstate how impossible this looked on paper. Existing explosives technology, however refined, operated on entirely different physical principles and offered no shortcuts. There was, quite simply, no precedent for what was being attempted, and no guarantee that any of the proposed methods would actually work. For the first 2 years after Einstein's letter reached Roosevelt's desk, American efforts remained modest, underfunded, and scattered across a handful of university laboratories. Hardly the crash program the moment seemed to demand. It was, in fact, British research that forced the pace. The Maud Committee report, delivered in the summer of 1941 by scientists working in a country already under nightly bombardment and facing invasion, concluded not only that a bomb was feasible, but that it might be built within roughly 2 years, a conclusion so far ahead of contemporary American thinking that it shocked Washington into action. Britain itself had already begun its own program, codenamed Tube Alloys, but by 1942 it had become clear that Britain, fighting for its survival and lacking the industrial capacity of the United States, could never build the necessary infrastructure alone. The subsequent decision to fold Tube Alloys into the American effort, formalized at the Quebec Conference in August 1943, brought a stream of British and Commonwealth scientists across the Atlantic, men such as James Chadwick, the physicist who had discovered the neutron itself, and, more troublingly for history, the German-born Klaus Fuchs, whose access to the project's innermost secrets would later prove catastrophic for Western intelligence. The man given the impossible task of turning this theoretical problem into a working weapon was Major General Leslie Groves, an Army engineer fresh from overseeing construction of the Pentagon, who took command of what was now codenamed the Manhattan Engineer District in September 1942. Groves was blunt, driven, and famously difficult to work for, but he possessed exactly the organizational ruthlessness the project required. His first major decision was to recruit Robert Oppenheimer, a theoretical physicist from Berkeley with no experience managing large projects and, worryingly for Army security, a series of past associations with communist organizations. Groves overruled his own security officers and appointed Oppenheimer to run the project's scientific heart, a new secret laboratory built almost overnight on a remote New Mexico mesa, at a site called Los Alamos, chosen partly because Oppenheimer had a fondness for the area from a boyhood ranch holiday. The scale of what followed is best understood through 3 vast industrial sites, each built essentially from nothing. At Oak Ridge, Tennessee, Workers threw up an entire secret city in a matter of months, eventually housing 75,000 people, most of whom had no idea what they were actually making. There, engineers built enormous factories using two competing methods to separate U-235 from U-238, one relying on gaseous diffusion through barriers pierced with holes narrower than a human hair, the other using giant electromagnetic tracks, nicknamed calutrons, that bent streams of charged uranium particles like a fairground ride sorting marbles by weight. The Y-12 plant alone eventually contained calutron magnets so vast that when the project later ran short of copper for the miles of wiring required, Groves borrowed roughly 14,700 tons of silver from the United States Treasury to wind the coils instead, since silver conducts electricity almost as well as copper and, crucially, was sitting unused in federal vaults. At Hanford, in the Washington desert, an entirely different city rose to houseworkers building nuclear reactors, cooled by water drawn from the Columbia River, designed to manufacture plutonium instead. And at Los Alamos itself, several thousand scientists and their families lived behind barbed wire, using false names and a single shared postal box address, while they worked out how to actually turn manufactured fissile material into a functioning bomb. The physics of that final step split into two entirely different designs, born from two entirely different engineering problems. The simpler approach, intended for uranium, worked essentially by firing one subcritical mass of material down a gun barrel into another, fast enough that the combined mass would go critical before it could blow itself apart, a method engineers were confident enough about that the resulting bomb, later named Little Boy, was never even test detonated before it was used in war. Plutonium, however, would not cooperate with this simple approach. It fissioned spontaneously too readily for a gun-type design to work, forcing Los Alamos scientists towards a far more delicate solution, one that compressed a plutonium core using a precisely shaped shell of conventional explosive lenses, arranged with an accuracy that had to be correct to within microseconds across the whole sphere simultaneously, rather like crushing a football perfectly evenly from every direction at once using dozens of separate hammers timed to land in the same instant. This implosion design was so uncertain that it demanded the Trinity test in the first place, since nobody was willing to use it in combat without proof that the physics actually worked. The manufacturing effort behind these designs dwarfed the science that made them possible. Production figures for enriched uranium and plutonium remained tightly classified for decades, and even now historians rely on partial records and post-war estimates rather than complete accounts, but what is known is staggering enough. Oak Ridge's gaseous diffusion plant, known as K-25, was at the time of its completion the largest building on Earth under a single roof. A U-shaped structure roughly 800 meters long, its miles of corridors lined with thousands of diffusion stages, each one nudging the uranium hexafluoride gas passing through it fractionally closer to weapons-usable purity. The scale of electricity required to run Oak Ridge's combined plants was so enormous that the site alone consumed roughly 1/7 of all the electric power generated in the United States at the height of the war, drawing on hydroelectric capacity from dams built under Roosevelt's own New Deal a decade earlier. At Hanford, engineers led by the DuPont Chemical Company built the world's first full-scale plutonium production reactors, enormous graphite piles laced with aluminium-clad uranium slugs, cooled by hundreds of millions of liters of river water pumped through each day and returned, warmed, to the Columbia. Workers on these reactors worked largely blind to their purpose, told only that they were producing material for the war, guided by engineers who themselves often understood only their own narrow segment of a process deliberately fragmented for secrecy. If you're finding this interesting so far, a quick subscribe genuinely helps more than you might think, and costs nothing at all. 3 weeks after the flash over Alamogordo, the world learned what had been built in the desert. On August 6, 1945, a B-29 bomber named Enola Gay released Little Boy over Hiroshima, and on August 9th, a second aircraft dropped the more complex implosion device, nicknamed Fat Man, over Nagasaki. Estimates of the immediate and longer-term death toll vary considerably, reflecting the chaos of the aftermath and the difficulty of separating deaths caused directly by the blast from those caused by burns, radiation sickness, and later illness. But most historians place combined fatality somewhere between 129,000 and 226,000 people by the end of 1945 alone, with many more dying of related causes in the years that followed. Survivor accounts from Hiroshima describe a flash brighter than any they had witnessed, followed by a wind that flattened wooden buildings for kilometers in every direction, and a black, oily rain that fell in the hours afterward, carrying radioactive fallout across the ruined city. The psychological effect on Japan's leadership, arriving within days of the Soviet Union's own declaration of war and invasion of Manchuria, contributed directly to Emperor Hirohito's decision to surrender, announced on August 15, 1945, bringing the Second World War to its final close. Crews aboard the bombers themselves, men who had trained for months without being told precisely what weapon they were carrying, described a shockwave that struck their aircraft even at altitude and distance, and a cloud that continued to boil upward long after they had turned for home. A sight none of them ever fully described in ordinary language again. It is worth pausing here to consider what Germany, the original justification for the entire project, had actually achieved. The German nuclear program, run under physicist Werner Heisenberg, never came close to a working weapon, hampered by a decision to rely on heavy water rather than graphite as a reactor moderator, by the emigration of many of its best physicists, and by a research culture that never received anything close to the resources or organizational drive that Groves brought to Manhattan. By the war's end, the Germans had built nothing resembling a functioning reactor, let alone a bomb. The Soviet Union, watching closely through an extensive espionage network that had penetrated Los Alamos itself, most notably through the physicist Klaus Fuchs, would go on to test its own bomb in 1949, 4 years after Trinity, using design information gleaned substantially from the very project meant to keep such knowledge secret. The comparison is stark. What America and Britain built together, at a scale Germany's fractured wartime economy could never have matched, was not simply a weapon, but an entire industrial ecosystem, built specifically to make that weapon possible, something no other combatant nation came close to replicating during the war itself. The legacy of those 2 blinding flashes over Japan is impossible to summarize neatly, and historians continue to argue over questions that will likely never be fully settled. What is not in dispute is the material fact that the world has not seen a nuclear weapon used in war since 1945, even as roughly a dozen nations went on to build their own arsenals during the Cold War that followed, whether the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki genuinely shortened the Pacific War, and at what human cost relative to the alternative of a land invasion, remains one of the most contested questions in modern history, and honest accounts of the period acknowledge that reasonable, well-informed people have reached very different conclusions. What can be said with more confidence is that the technical and scientific groundwork laid at Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, and Hanford shaped the entire architecture of the post-war world, from the doctrine of mutually assured destruction to the civilian nuclear power industry that eventually grew from the same reactor science. Visitors today can see the physical remnants of that history at the National Museum of Nuclear Science and History in Albuquerque, at the preserved reactor buildings of the Hanford site, and at the Bradbury Science Museum in Los Alamos itself, standing on the same mesa where Oppenheimer's team once worked behind barbed wire under assumed names. Return for a moment to that desert morning in July 1945, to the rain-soaked bunker and the switch thrown at 5.29. What happened in that instant was not simply the detonation of a new kind of bomb. It was the closing of a door that could never again be fully shut. Before Trinity, humanity had built weapons of extraordinary destructive power, weapons that could level cities and kill by the tens of thousands. but weapons that still operated, fundamentally, on the same chemical principles as gunpowder had for centuries. After Trinity, an entirely different category of weapon existed, one drawing not on chemistry but on the structure of the atom itself, one whose destructive power could be scaled almost without limit. Kenneth Bainbridge's blunt verdict on the bunker floor that they were now all sons of bitches was not despair so much as recognition, the recognition of men who had just proven something they had spent years hoping quietly would turn out to be impossible. It was not impossible. It had taken over 130,000 workers, more than $2 billion, 3 secret cities built from nothing, and the finest collection of physicists ever assembled in one place. But it had been done. The scientists of Los Alamos had set out to answer a question posed by a frightened letter in 1939, a question about whether an atom could be split apart on a scale large enough to end wars, and in the New Mexico desert 6 years later, they received their answer in the form of a light brighter than the sun. What they had built could never be unbuilt. What they had learned could never be unlearned. And the world that watched the mushroom cloud rise over that rain-soaked basin, whether it fully understood so at the time or not, had just stepped across a line it would spend the rest of the century and every century after trying to live with.